Tom Clancy's The Division 2 is the sequel to Massive Entertainment and Ubisoft's first looter shooter game. The Division 1 had several delays, issues on launch, and ended up being far from perfect, followed by other attempts in the same genre such as Destiny 2 and more recently Anthem, none of which quite hit the jackpot either. In this video, I'll be covering what looter shooter games need to get right to have a longer lifespan and maintain an interested fanbase, and how The Division 2 fits into that discussion. The looter shooter genre started taking shape back in 2009 with the release of Borderlands, a game classified as an action role-playing game with shooting and looting aspects being highlighted as key features back then. Later on, with the success of Borderlands 2, more developers and publishers started looking to make games of that kind, and it was only a year later, in 2013, that Digital Extremes launched their free-to-play shooter MMO, Warframe. This was when the ARPG subgenre we know today as looter shooter began to emerge, as that same year at E3, Bungie and Activision showed off Destiny to the world for the very first time. Taking on characteristics from co-op shooter games in shooting and looting, mixed with the basic MMO formula, this was looking to be a successful new style of games, with many parties beginning to invest heavily around that time. 5 years later in 2019, the looter shooter games seemed to have been cursed with one rough launch after the other, and it didn't look like we were getting any closer to the looter shooter experience that, judging from the consistently high sales numbers at least, many players want, and want badly. To put it simply, there is clearly a demand for games that offer the loot variety and character build depth of successful titles such as Diablo 2 and Path of Exile, but replacing the top-down point-and-click looter part with the fun, arguably more approachable and casual-friendly shooter gameplay. This new subgenre has been interesting to follow, however many of the games in that category have mostly focused on the shooter part of it, and then done poorly on the looter side. Trailers with flashy graphics and cool action scenes tend to move units, and why stop if it's working? Destiny 1 and 2, The Division 1 and Anthem have all suffered from this and fall into a category of games that have this fantastic looking outer shell but feel hollow and soulless inside, especially over time. I made this graphic to explain a bit better exactly what I'm getting at here. First on here, we have Diablo 3, a great example of an ARPG that ultimately failed in the long run by, to put it in very simple terms, having poor gear variety as a result of changes they've made from previous Diablo games, a fairly lacking endgame for die-hard fans to engage in, but very pretty graphics. Diablo 3 looks great even if you have no idea what's going on, and it got very far with that alone, and of course its Blizzard trademark storytelling. Nowadays that top-down looter ARPG genre is dominated by Path of Exile, a free-to-play game that gives players the freedom they want with gear, loot and other features that allow for deep and rich gameplay, resulting in players putting a ridiculous amount of hours into its endgame, all of this with graphics and animation that doesn't quite match the quality of Diablo 3. Let's take this recipe we've created for ARPGs and apply that to the looter shooter genre with Anthem as our first example. The Diablo 3 traits we defined earlier can be applied here and are scarily accurate for describing Anthem as well. Poor gear variety, weak build depth, lacking endgame, but pretty graphics. So what is the looter shooter genre's Path of Exile equivalent then? This is where it gets really interesting and where The Division 2 comes into the picture. Tom Clancy's The Division 2 takes place in Washington, DC, after the outbreak in the first game and with a long way to go to restore the world to what it once was. Let's take a look at that very simplified list of characteristics again, beginning with gear variety. The Division 2 provides all the standard stats you'd expect for gear and guns, such as armor, damage, reload speed, accuracy, fire rate, and many more. Looter shooter games tend to also have extra properties on certain loot, unique attributes for more special pieces of loot, giving weapons such things as higher damage with more kills, higher fire rate as you keep shooting, and the Division 2 is no different here. Except instead of just adding one extra property to each late game piece, they allow for more specific stat rolls on top of that, potentially increasing headshot damage, crit chance, or damage output from certain weapons, alongside set bonuses as well that reward the player for using certain pieces of gear together at the same time. They're clearly not afraid to expand a little bit here, and these are great improvements which allow for more types of gear to drop, and even pieces of the same gear to exist that can still do different things. Something you'd expect from a game where 50% of the genre name is focused on loot. It's nothing groundbreaking at all, but it is a good start. It takes what most looter shooter games already offer in this section and adds another layer on top. There are also ways to adjust your gear after you've acquired it by reconfiguring, removing and changing certain properties of those pieces. This adds yet another layer, and together with the decent extra perks you can throw onto gear using mods, you've got quite a bit of gear optimization to get into. This brings me to the next thing on my list, build depth. I don't think this game has it all figured out here at all. In fact, I'd say that right now it's even pretty difficult to create precise builds that are good at one certain thing, at least if you're just trying to invest heavily into one or a couple individual stats to nail down a special niche, which is kind of what character building in most RPGs is all about, especially if you play them a lot. But potentially to actually make up for this, you've got specializations. This allows players to pick up, at release and recording of this video at least, one of 3 signature weapons, as well as more stats and gadgets related to that same build. This again is the game taking that extra step, offering players more choice and with that creating more depth. You've got similar specializations and classes in other games, but The Division 2 allows you to switch much more freely here, and also makes it much easier for itself to add onto this system later down the line. So this again is the game just taking that extra step, offering players more choice and with that creating more depth. Great initiative, although I'd love to see the developers go even further here by offering a couple more specializations. I think 3 on launch is a little bit weak, as well as taking those specs down more unique paths. They're good, but could be better. Onto Endgame, a word that is thrown around so much nowadays, especially in the looter shooter space, that I feel like it's starting to lose all meaning. Endgame should not just be content pasted on top of the rest of the game in an effort to create more replayability value to have players stick around, consequently having those same players invest into microtransactions along the way. Anthem did a horrible job here, with its extra difficulty levels just increasing health and damage, loot drop rates and such being very poorly managed, and in addition to that, just frequently reusing entire side quest mechanics and even full story missions for endgame strongholds, making it a very repetitive experience. Destiny 2 tried to add their own take on dungeons or strongholds with strikes, nightfalls and eventually a raid shortly after launch, and succeeded to some degree with this, but had a poor rotation of weekly content plus recycled levels and objectives for that same endgame. A step above Anthem, but still not enough, especially for launch. The Division 2 is unfortunately not too much better when it comes to the amount of dungeons or strongholds, but it recognizes this and does a surprisingly good job at addressing it. Here's how. Throughout the game, you are introduced to quite a few different enemy types, as well as tougher versions of them. As you head into endgame, these enemies are transformed to not have the player face exactly the same ones over and over, and it's refreshing, gives the game new life and even to some degree a new look. This means that difficulty can be ramped up using those varying enemy types with a higher frequency of the more versatile ones to raise the difficulty bar, changing the experience enough for it to not feel repetitive. This is something Destiny and especially Anthem struggled with so bad, and it enhances the endgame for The Division enormously. In addition to that solid core game, you have Dark Zones that offer a slightly different gameplay experience to get gear, a 4v4 multiplayer mode that is far from ideal but still playable, additional world event mechanics that are all worthwhile doing and can be challenging if you want them to be, as well as many secrets scattered around downtown DC, is what sets The Division 2 apart from other previous looter shooter games. Skill Up made a great video if you want to really get into the details of that, but all in all, The Division 2 does a lot of looter shooter things right, to the point where it's brought the genre just a little bit further. With many improvements that could be made to the loot system, the occasional game-breaking bug, and flawed storytelling, it's definitely no masterpiece. The pre-order gameplay enhancing aspects of exotic guns only available for players that wanted to pay up before they even had the full game also leaves a sour taste in my mouth, to say the least. But as much as I dislike that, I also appreciate what The Division 2 has done for the looter shooter genre. To go back to that graphic we were looking at earlier, I don't think this game is good enough to fill this final slot, but it sure has gotten us a whole lot closer to whatever that game may be.